I've never heard of anything quite like this before.
I don't have an incredibly strong opinion one way or the other, so I'm kind of really interested to hear both sides of the story and to ask some questions.
I'm not expecting too much from tonight's debate, but from the people I've talked to so far, some of them seem to be relatively sane.
One of the great things about this Parliament is the idea that people can hold up a flyer that says cite your evidence, because if that happened in our House of Parliament, I think we get a much higher quality of debate. It's very interesting they've got a rhetoric officer here to help people understand the kind of language that is used, the way in which language itself can manipulate.
What I'm doing here today is commenting on people's use of language. So I'll be looking for anyone who uses particularly manipulative language or uses arguments in certain ways that I think are problematic, pointing out some of the ways in which language can be used to sway debates one way or the other.
I'm here tonight to see whether people can actually talk about things in a way that explores all the issues, allows people to change their mind and allows people to understand and deal with complexity.
Thanks so much everyone for coming out. This is a very strange, innovative, novel, weird way of doing political debate, but let's give it a shot and see what happens. The aim of the Rational Parliament is to test whether we can have a different kind of political debate if we have researchers in the room, relevant academics who study the topic that we're arguing about and debating about, and also if we have a few gimmicks to keep the debate flowing. The government has loads and loads of academics and scientists and researchers at its disposal, and it takes lots of advice from them, but why shouldn't we try and do that as well? So there's a few researchers here in the room who have studied GM from different angles. Either they're GM scientists themselves, or they have studied how GM works in our society and in our culture. One of the key things here tonight is, as you can see, we don't have a panel of experts. These two here, they're not our panel, they're not our experts, they're just functionaries of the Parliament. They're just clerks like me. It's you lot who are the MPs basically, the members of the Rational Parliament, the MRPs. You're voted in. We're just here to make the whole thing go smoothly as possible.
And now I'm going to declare this session open, and I'm going to invite John Lucas from Rothamsted to give his opening 5 minutes.
If you are a papaya grower in Hawaii, that industry went bust as a result of virus infections, and now it's thriving because they have effective transgenic control of viruses. My point tonight is not to say I'm pro-GM or anti-GM, it's purely to say why should we be depriving ourselves of some of the tools available to us in the fight against world hunger because of applying criteria to that technology that we do not apply to others. That's my point, and thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, thank you, John.
We have an incredible oligopoly in the seed market around the world. 3 companies control 70% of the seed market, 3 GM companies. And they are interested in making money on intellectual property. And so it is no surprise that techniques like marker-assisted selection or participatory breeding of the kinds I mentioned are completely like Cinderella, not invited to the party, despite the fact that I would contend they offer better ways of advancing productivity. But they are not promoted because they do not offer ways for big corporations to make an awful lot of money. I am very skeptical, as may come out in the debate, about GM. Skepticism is not something to be ashamed of, as it's irrational. Skepticism is actually the founding quality of science itself. It is why science is so phenomenally successful, because it allows skeptical spaces. And what's really worrying for me about debates about GM is not so much the content of the technology, which I do think presents uncertainties. It's what it does to debate. It's what it does to democracy. It forces us into this polarized attitude, either this or nothing. Do you want to feed the world or not? This is the only choice. And that, for me, is the most corrosive thing.
In response to some of the things that the previous speakers were saying, my concern is that we don't have access to sufficient information, impartial, independent, scientific research in order to make any judgment of our own, rational or emotional.
I've been a member of the Soil Association since 1985, when Monsanto tried to introduce bovine somatotropin into the cattle herd. So that's where I'm coming from. That was before BSE. The reason people pull up the field trials is because when that stuff gets out, it's out. You can't do anything about it. The people who plant the field trials are the vandals.
Do you think that destroying field trials is acceptable behaviour?
Yes.
I'm not a scientist, and I'm certainly not personally capable of, nor willing to spend the time and effort researching this myself, looking at reports and trying to understand them, even if I were capable. So where do I turn for some sort of relatively independent, comprehensive view of what the research says? I think there's a sort of institutional issue of where is there an independent source of reasonably authoritative advice.
If you think there is something that you can trust that would take these matters forward, then show me your black side. And if you think there really isn't anyone that you can trust who's overseeing all of this, then I'd like to see the white side. It's really quite similar, would you say? It's maybe 60-40 for the white.
Some interesting metaphors: coming down the track, locked in, crowded out, and all of these are negatively connoted in some ways. So trains run on tracks, they're hard to stop, they can't change direction. Locked in and crowded out have other obvious connotations. So a few, very briefly, other members appealed to our lack of knowledge. Now that's a dangerous way of arguing, because not having proof for something doesn't mean it's wrong necessarily.
One of the fundamental things we have to be thinking about when we talk about meeting food demand isn't simply about increasing the amount of food, but how distribution works under the current system.
GM copyright issues will reduce the access and distribution of food to people in poverty.
Okay, thank you. That's obviously a fear that I think would be shared by a number of people. The vote now is, can we trust large corporations with patents on our most basic foodstuffs? White is no, black is yes. That's absolutely overwhelmingly a no vote, that we cannot trust corporations.
I worked in Brazil last year for 5 months. In Brapa, the government agency, agricultural agency there, has just produced transgenic field beans. They're grown by family farmers, and they're being distributed to those farmers at minimal cost. So it's not all dominated by Monsanto, and it's not all down to political choices. What about the farmers' choices?
There have been feeding trials on animals by the companies. Now, the regulators depend on the studies that are produced by the GM company that wants to get approval for the seeds.
Can I ask, is anybody willing to talk about the problems that might be caused if we embark on a series of trials of genetically modified crops? Sorry, yes, we haven't heard your voice here, the member here at the front in the black t-shirt.
Another industry, which is the pharmaceutical industry, of which we all use products, conduct their own trials. So it's the company that conducts its own trial to show whether the drug is effective or not. And we have trusted that process, and we've trusted that over a century now. And that has improved our life expectancy from 50 to 85 that's there in the developed countries.
My honourable friend in the red t-shirt over there said, without evidence, we have the food. When he finished what he said, both the scientists here applauded him. Do we have the food? What's the evidence that we have the food? And if we do have the food, that completely undermines the case that we need GM to create more food. So can we have some clarification on that point, please?
Can anyone make a clarification on that?
My name's Matt. I'm a PhD student at Rothamsted. I don't work in GM technology, but I did bring with me one review. Food security, the challenge of feeding 9 billion people, continuing populations and consumption growth will mean that global demand for food will increase for at least another 40 years. Growing competition for land, water and energy, in addition to the overexploitation of fisheries, will affect our ability to produce food, as will the urgent requirement to reduce the impact of the food system on the environment. So this is published thing. There is data to support it in this.
Published where?
It's published in Science, and it's Godfrey and John Beddington, in fact, who's our former Chief Scientific Officer.
Okay.
We started by hearing that there's millions of hectares that are currently under GM cultivation, and that it's spread across 26, 28 countries in the world. And then we're talking about having to conduct trials to check its safety. I'd really like to understand why we just haven't had a mega global trial that tells us a lot of the answers anyway.
We're going to pause the debate for a minute. We're going to kind of press pause on this. I'm going to ask you over the next 20 minutes, I think, if you can come up to the ballot box and cast your votes.
The House agrees that GM food has a contribution to make in meeting global food demand. The vote in the National Parliament, we passed the motion with one abstention posted in the box. So, motion passed.
The best thing about tonight was the manner in which the debate was conducted. It was very respectful, very restrained, but also the passion was there.
I thought it was brilliant, and I thought the whole idea is excellent, and I love it, and I hope this is the first of many.
Even though we complain about the British Parliament, if you look at the Indian Parliament, that's worse. So, you know, we didn't go that direction, which is great.
That was absolutely fantastic. I was really, really impressed. As an American, I've always been a great admirer of the British tradition of debate, and tonight was a wonderful example of that. In a certain sense, as part of a democracy, it doesn't matter whether or not everyone agrees at the end, but that all views are aired in a civilized and entertaining and intelligent way, and so I really, really enjoyed it.
It was a bit frustrating because I didn't feel as there were many people who agreed with me.